now. Dr. Joseph Healy, as I said, is one of the founding members of the London Irish LGBT Network, but he is also our resident historian. He comes from Dublin and studied Eastern European history at UCC and Glasgow University, along with Russian and German. So if there's anybody you want to find out, or anyone wants to talk about Russian stuff, he's the man to go to right now. He was a veteran activist in the LGBT rights movement in Ireland in the early 1980s, and has been active in the HIV rights movement as a trade union activist, sitting on the London and Eastern Regional LGBT Committee of Unite, as well as the National Committee. He's been really, really busy, in other words. He's involved in lots of stuff. And uh, he's, if you want to know anything, Joseph's the man who'll be able to clear it up for you. He's been working in the charity sector for 18 years, and he has recently retired. And he, just because he's retired now doesn't mean that he's sitting on his laurels. He's busier than ever, and I believe he's actually working on a book as well. So I'm going to hand it over to yourself, Dr. Joseph Healy.
Well, thank you, Vanessa, for that glowing introduction. So I'm going to talk tonight about one of the most controversial characters in modern Irish history, Roger Casement, where controversy still rages about his sexuality, his background, and his role in 1916 and so on, and his subsequent trial. I wanted to begin with two memories, personal anecdotes from me of Roger Casement. One is being an 8-year-old child in Dublin in 1965, when Roger Casement's body was exhumed from Pentonville prison, where he'd been buried in quicklime as a prisoner executed there. And there'd been an agreement between the British and Irish government to repatriate his body to Dublin. And there was a state funeral, and we as school children were given the day off to stand in the rain and see the funeral of this great hero of Irish independence, who was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in the Republican plot there. I went last year, actually, again to see his grave. First time I'd seen it in a very, very long time. What's interesting about this is that Casement himself wanted to be buried in County Antrim in the north of Ireland, where he had family roots and so on, and said, I want to be buried near Murlough Bay. But the British government laid down that the Irish government could only have his body on condition that he was not buried in the north of Ireland, because they believed that it would cause unrest between nationalists and unionists. And I would certainly hope that at some day in the future, he can be buried in County Antrim, which is where he wanted originally to be buried. I think his burial in Dublin was essentially a compromise. The second memory I have is of being in my 20s in a Republican bar in West Belfast and shouting out, Roger Casement is gay, was gay, and being told, you better get the fuck out of here soon or you'll get kneecapped. Because the perception from the Republican movement at the time, and we'll talk about this later, was that there was no way that such a heroic Catholic Republican martyr, as he was perceived, could have been a homosexual. And that controversy remains to this day, and I will address some of that. So who was Roger Casement? Well, he was, I would argue in some ways, the late 19th century, early 20th century equivalent of somebody like David Miliband. He was seen as a an international campaigner for human rights, in the same way that David Miliband nowadays appears on television to talk about refugee rights and things like that. Casement had built up this international reputation as a campaigner for human rights. But I want to begin by looking at a novel by the Peruvian Nobel-winning prize writer Mario Vargas Llosa, who wrote a book about Casement called The Dream of the Celt. Now, why did Llosa write a book about Casement? I think partly because some of Casement's work on human rights was actually based in Peru, from where Llosa himself came from. And I just want to read this little section here, which will explain the atmosphere in 1916. This is after Casement has been taken by the British. He's now a prisoner. He's been sentenced to death for treason. And there is an appeal for clemency going to the British government. And he's in Pentonville prison. When he entered the narrow visitor's room, his heart sank. Waiting for him was not his attorney, George Gavin Duffy, but one of his assistants, a blonde, sickly-looking young man with prominent cheekbones, who dressed like a fop, and whom he had seen during the first 4 days of his trial, carrying and fetching papers for the defense lawyers. Why, instead of coming in person, had Gavin Duffy sent one of his clerks? The young man looked at him coldly. Anger and disgust were in his eyes. What was wrong with this imbecile? He looks at me as if I were a vermin, thought Roger. Any news? The young man shook his head. He inhaled before speaking. Regarding the petition for pardon, not yet. He murmured, making a face that made him look even sicklier. It's necessary to wait for the Council of Ministers to meet. The presence of the sheriff and another guard in the small room irritated Roger. Though they remained silent, he knew they were listening to everything. The idea oppressed his chest and made it difficult for him to breathe. But considering recent events, the blonde young man added, blinking for the first time and opening his mouth, everything is more difficult now. Outside news doesn't reach Pentonville, said Roger. What's happened? What if the German Admiralty had finally decided to attack Great Britain from the Irish coast? What if the dreamed of invasion had taken place and the Kaiser's cannon were avenging at this very moment the Irish patriots shot by the English in the Easter Rising? If the war had taken that direction, his plans would be realized in spite of everything. The clerk repeated, now it has become difficult, perhaps impossible to succeed. He was pale, containing his indignation. He sensed that behind him the sheriff was smiling. What are you talking about? Mr. Gavin Duffy was optimistic about the petition. What happened to make him change his mind? Your diaries, the young man hissed, making another disgusted face. He had lowered his voice, and it was difficult for Roger to hear him. Scotland Yard found them in your house in Ebury Street. He paused for a long time, waiting for Roger to say something. But since he had fallen mute, the clerk gave free rein to his indignation. My good man, how could you be so stupid? He spoke slowly, making his rage more obvious. How could you, my good man, put such things on paper? And if you did, how could you not take the basic precaution of destroying those diaries before embarking on a conspiracy against the British Empire? It's an insult for this fellow to call me my good man, Roger thought. Ill-mannered because Roger was at least twice the age of this boy. Portions of these diaries are circulating everywhere, the clerk added, though his disgust was constant. In the Admiralty, the minister's spokesman, Reginald Hall himself, has given copies to dozens of reporters. They're all over London, in Parliament, the House of Lords, the Liberal and Conservative clubs, editorial offices, churches. It's the only topic of conversation in the city. Roger did not say anything. He did not move. Once again, he had a strange sensation that had taken hold of him many times in recent months, ever since that grey April morning in 1916, when, numb with cold, he was arrested in the ruins of McKenna's fort in the south of Ireland. This did not have to do with him. They were talking about someone else. These things were happening to someone else. I know your private life is not my business, or Mr. Gavin Duffy's, or anyone's, said the young clerk. This is a strictly professional matter. Mr. Gavin Duffy wanted to bring you up to date regarding the situation and prepare you. The request for clemency may be compromised. This morning, there are already protests in some newspapers, rumors regarding the content of your diaries. The favorable public response to the petition might be affected. Merely a supposition, of course. Mr. Gavin Duffy will keep you informed. Do you wish me to give him a message? Now, this is clearly a description of what has happened, in that the British Home Office, the early MI5, have uncovered the so-called black diaries, the secret diaries of Roger Casement. And the end result of these diaries being exposed is that the Home Office invites various prominent members of British society, many of whom were supporters of Roger Casement and wanted his clemency to be agreed. They're brought in one by one and shown the diaries. And as a result of the shocking contents of the diaries, detailing his homosexual acts and so on, they withdraw their support for the clemency. This happens to several people. Conan Doyle, who was a supporter of his, Bernard Shaw, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and various other people. When they see the contents of the diary, they're so appalled that they withdraw their support. And in so doing, the prosecution and the British government achieve their desired result, which means that the clemency is refused and Roger Casement is hanged. During the course of the trial, there was an attempt by the prosecution to the defense, an offer that if the defense agreed, they would publish the diaries, claiming that Roger Casement was insane, because the diaries would demonstrate that he was insane. And that the end result of this would be that he would not be executed, but would be classified as insane. Now, Roger Casement refused this strategy. And you can, of course, see why, because on the one hand, it would have negated completely his struggle for Irish independence and support for the 1916 Rising. But on the other hand as well, it would have blackened his name by accepting that the diaries were a true account of what happened. Now, in order to understand why Casement was such a celebrity, if you like, we need to go back a bit to look at his whole career. And his career was that essentially he was a prominent British civil servant, very much a member of the establishment. And he was appointed as the consul, the British consul to the Congo, and commissioned in 1903 to write a report on what was happening in the Congo. Now, the Congo in 1885, the Berlin Conference was carving up Africa between the various European powers, especially those who hadn't already established colonies in Africa. And the Congo ended up being given as a personal fiefdom to the King of Belgium, Leopold. And so it became the Congo Free State. The thing about the Congo was that it had vast reserves of rubber. Now, rubber at that time was absolutely essential to industrialization and was important probably as oil is today. And the Congo had vast reserves of rubber, and Leopold set out to set up essentially a slave state in the Congo, which meant that huge numbers of African people were set to work producing rubber. They had quotas. If your quota was not fulfilled, your hands could be cut off, or you could be executed. So the horrors and the human rights violations in the Congo were absolutely indescribable. And reports of this had leaked out, and the British had commissioned Casement to mount an investigation of this. So he went out to the Congo, and in 1904 he produced the Casement report, and the result was electrifying. I mean, the whole of Europe was convulsed by this report, which really detailed what was going on in the Congo. And the result of this was that there was an investigation in the Belgian parliament. And the end result was that Leopold was so the whole of Belgium was so scandalized by this that Leopold was forced to give up the Congo, and it was taken over by the Belgian state instead. So, I mean, the sort of things that happened in the Congo were indescribable, but they were a very clear example of colonialism at its worst and the sort of things that colonialism was capable of. Now, you can imagine that after Casement had produced this report, I mean, his reputation was, really enhanced in Britain, and many famous people supported him and so on. And on the back of what he'd achieved in the Congo, he was sent in 1910 to the Putumayo district, which was in the very far north of Peru in Amazonia. Again, rubber production was the thing there, rubber industry. And there was a private company running this entire area called the Peruvian Amazon Company. Now, this was a British company registered in London, mainly with British shareholders, but it was led by a robber baron from Peru called Julio Arana. And again, there were reports of wholesale, human rights abuses, murders, executions, torture, and all the rest. And Casement set out for Amazonia, investigated this, and again produced a really damning report detailing in huge detail what was happening and the horrors that were being inflicted on the native peoples by this company. And in the end result, again, was that the company was dissolved, Arana lost his power and so on, and the Peruvian government was forced to act. And as a result of this, Casement was knighted in 1911, becoming Sir Roger Casement. So he was the height of his fame, if you like, within the British Empire's establishment. Now, of course, the interesting question is what Casement saw firsthand of colonialism changed his whole perception of European colonialism in both Africa and Latin America. And he wrote in a letter in 1913, and 1913 is seen as the turning point at which he begins to move away from becoming a member of the British establishment and more towards becoming a supporter of Irish nationalism. And he writes in 1913, I had accepted imperialism and British rule was to be accepted at all cost because it was the best for everyone under the sun, and that those who opposed it ought to be smashed. And finally, when up in those lonely Congo forests where I found Leopold, I also found myself, the incorrigible Irishman. So from 1913, there is this change in Casement. There is this awakening to both his Irishness, but also to the nature of the British Empire and the nature of colonialism as he has witnessed it in Africa and elsewhere. And the diaries, the original Black Diaries, are now held in the British National Archives in Kew. And interestingly enough, there is an exhibition on at the moment there called Treason, where the archives feature prominently. Now, there continues to be a big debate between Casement's two main biographers, one of whom is an Irish writer called Angus Mitchell, who claims that the diaries were a fabrication and a forgery, and they were meant to destroy Casement's reputation. This has been always the argument put forward by Irish republicanism, that the diaries were essentially dirty dealing by the British government to undermine Casement. His other main biographer is Geoffrey Dudgeon, who's a famous gay rights activist from the north of Ireland, who brought the court case to the European Court of Human Rights, which led to the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the north of Ireland. And Geoffrey Dudgeon is a unionist councillor in Belfast. He's written a major work on the Black Diaries, which I have here, a massive tome, which, you know, where he has the original diaries, and he has he's done extensive research into the background, and he claims, Geoffrey Dudgeon, that the diaries are genuine. And I'll come to Geoffrey and his book in a minute. But in 2016, in the centenary of 1916, the other biographer, Angus Mitchell, wrote a book on Casement as part of a set of books called 1916 Lives, which were published by the O'Brien Press. And it's this list of biographies, you can still get them, of all the leaders of the 1916 rebellion, and Casement is one of them. And in this book, Mitchell argues vociferously that the diaries are forgeries. Again, that they, you know, they're fabrications which have been set up, they had a deliberate purpose. And Mitchell writes, once Casement's treason had been identified, the challenge to the British authorities was intricately bound up with controlling his narrative. In the century that has passed since his death, it is evident that an internal policy had evolved whereby Casement's story was framed and manipulated for public consumption. Through a mix of officially agreed deception, the engineering of his archives, and the maintenance of a policy of confusion, his history was shaped in a manner that was amenable to a retreating British Empire and a partitioned Ireland. So for Mitchell, any attempt to claim authenticity for the diaries is false and is a deliberate political act. These are the two polar opposite positions on Casement. The other thing we should bear in mind is that Casement converted to Catholicism on the day before he died. His mother had been a Catholic who converted to Protestantism. He had been born in Dublin from an Anglo-Irish family. His family's estate was in County Antrim. And I mentioned Geoff Dudgeon, and when Geoff Dudgeon took part in a symposium, which I attended in 2016 in the British Library about the 1916 Rising, and he gave a paper on Casement. And his opening lines were that Roger Casement was a traitor to his country and his class. You know, pretty strong stuff, which I disputed at the time. I objected to the way in which he cast it. But Geoff is coming from a particular unionist position, and that is how he perceives Casement. However, I have to say that I do agree with Geoff that I think the diaries are authentic. And I think he's done a very, very good job in his book of showing that. And he's also shown in his book that Casement had, in fact, an Irish lover from Belfast called Gordon Miller. And he's actually found, dug up a lot of the evidence of Miller's address and all the rest. And Miller later moved to Dublin and died many years later in Dublin. And in his book, Geoff Dudgeon makes the point that in 1916, when the British were looking at the diaries, there was actually correspondence where they were suggesting that they were going to drag up Gordon Miller's name and his connection with Casement. But in the end, they didn't feel it was necessary. But Jeff goes on to argue that Miller must have lived a very nervous life. I mean, he married in later years, but that he must have, he had a relationship with Casement between 1908 and 1913. And 1913, again, is the point at which Casement veers off in the direction of republicanism. And Miller came from a Protestant family, and they signed the 1912 Ulster Covenant, which if people know their history, was the covenant, swearing that Ulster would never support home rule and so on. But Jeff Dudgeon shows in his book that Gordon Miller, under Casement's influence, gradually moved to become a home ruler and then a supporter of independence. And he details the secretive trysts, the secretive meetings between Gordon Miller and Casement. But he makes the point in the book that, they were living a secret life. They were living a very, under the radar life as two gay men in the Ireland of the early 20th century. And he says that Miller must have lived the rest of his life in constant fear that if the diaries were published, and there were several books which appeared about the diaries, that the truth of their relationship might be revealed and Miller himself might be outed as a gay man, which at that time would have been, very, very detrimental to his career and all the rest. But the other controversial aspect of the Black Diaries is, and the reason why people were so shocked and so on at the time, was because they give detailed descriptions of Casement's sexual exploits, particularly with indigenous people in Peru. And one of his friends who saw the diaries made the point that he was very glad that he'd been a Baptist minister who'd been a friend of Casement's in the Congo, and made the point that at least these things didn't happen in the Congo, because perhaps the reason why they hadn't happened was because he and various other people had influenced Casement to keep away from sin or whatever as he saw it. So I'm just going to read two excerpts. And when I read these before, I gave this talk back in 2016 in the Irish Centre in Camden to a mixed audience, and there were some people who did seem, a century later, still genuinely shocked by the diary entries. So I hope it won't have the same impact tonight. So this is Saturday the 30th. Young Portuguese in Hotel Gardens, hair and beard cut. Saw Dr. Dickey with him and the Shopes in the afternoon. Indian Kakolo boy or so, well dressed, and followed and smiled. In evening, as I was walking up to Alhambra, he overtook me and smiled, and so I said, "Pasear." And he'd once agreed and told me he'd been thinking of me all day since he first saw me, and came out only to procure me. Walked to the old palace, squeezed soft, cool hand, saw his honey, and then he to Alhambra till 8 p.m. tomorrow night. His last words were, "Now me falta, don't stand me up." Later, a Kokodo work servant boy, sturdy limbs in gardens, mine huge as he pulled it out. Others came, so I fled, leaving him on seat without word. So yeah, it doesn't leave very much to the imagination now. And again, there's another diary entry. Out to coffee and then by tram to brewery and to Flores. And then the boys, these are Barbadian stewards. Then to the hotel where Dr. D called to say Hilda not going until tomorrow morning. So out and in bookshop, young Barbados man, very smart and huge one, looked once at me and smiled and came over and asked if American, and agreed to meet at Bar Vaughan at 8. There, but did not see him. Then met young Perance, and again last year. Sweet, smiled and followed. Stiff and long, about 7 inches, and said loved it, and got it in fearfully long time, clasping and kissing and pushing hard. Bathed in sweat, said he liked it awfully, but was afraid, and Vergonia ashamed. Then lovely Paraboy too, cock-a-blow, and got it huge. Said he would come, but shy and refused money. It got stiff, and I knew he was warming. He asked where I lived. So again, pretty detailed descriptions there of gay sexual activities. And you can imagine the impact of this being shown in 1916 to various people who were brought in by the Home Office and shown these. So I'd just like to say, as regards the authenticity of the diaries, there was a report done in 2000 by handwriting experts and so on called the Giles Report, which the British government accepted as genuine, unsurprisingly, but also the Irish government accepted. And I think that report, there's been controversy again from people like Angus Mitchell, who I mentioned earlier, who've disputed its findings. But I think that report was fairly conclusive that the diaries are, authentic. But it raises a lot of issues. Some have claimed that Casement was essentially, a sex tourist, as he was having these relationships, usually for money, with young men in Latin America, in Peru, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's been argued that their ages were generally between 17 and 20. So, in modern day legal situations, they would have had the right of the age of consent and so on and so forth. So, but this is one of the many aspects, I think, of the controversy. But I think the fact remains that Casement, because of his experience of colonialism, both in Congo and in Amazonia and so on, became very aware of the nature of colonialism, the nature of the exploitation of native peoples, and that drove him increasingly towards republicanism, towards a rejection of imperialism and the British Empire and so on. But I think it also remains, we've talked before about many of the women involved in 1916 have been revealed in recent research to have been lesbian. There were many lesbian couples and so on. And I would argue that Casement is probably the most prominent gay man that we know of who was involved in the 1916 Rising. So I think Jeff Judgeon has done us all a service by his extensive research into Casement's life. And I think we should welcome the fact that there was a gay man active in the 1916 Rising, and I think it's about time that Irish republicanism and so on accepts him for that and for coming together both as a political activist, and also clearly he wasn't, in terms of the early 20th century, he can in no way be described as somebody who fought for homosexual rights or whatever. But I think at the same time, a century on, we have to accept that he was probably, a gay fighter for Irish independence and against imperialism. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Right, it's 2022. If anybody has any comments or wants to say anything, please do say it, because I'm ashamed to say I don't know enough about Irish history. I can tell you my 20-year-old niece knows about 10 times as much about Irish history as I do. But I know you're preaching to the converted here, but is it really that big of a deal if he was gay? Really? I know it's a different time and the world was a different place, a very different place. But does it really make any difference? No.
Leslie, can I chime in?
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Leslie. And thanks, Joseph. That was very interesting. I mean, I'm casting back to when I was in school, not quite as long ago as you, Joseph. I thought when you were going to the personal anecdote with Roger Casement for a scary minute, I thought you were going to mention having met him. But anyway, the presentation of Casement was as kind of a romantic fool. They didn't mention the controversy about the diaries and things, as I recall, but that his attempt to land arms on Bannow Strand, wasn't it, was actually doomed all along, and that he was kind of set up, and that he was a bit of a sort of a dim aristo, really, who romantically joined the cause but didn't really help. I mean, that to me is perhaps a more rather than his sexuality, is more of a challenge to his place in the fundament of heroes of Irish independence. And I wonder if you have any comment on that. And then the second thing about gay people, or particularly gay men in 1916, the way Pearse was presented to us was, by Christian Brothers, if I recall, was even with more than a nudge, nudge, wink, wink about his own sexuality. So, and I don't think there was ever an attempt to say that he was, at the very least, that Pearse was a bit odd, if not a good deal more than that. So, again, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, several interesting questions, Andrew. It's interesting that Jeff Dudgeon says in his book that if Casement had survived, he could have ended up as the first president of Ireland instead of Douglas Hyde. I mean, Douglas Hyde was a Protestant who had been active in the Irish language movement, Conor na Gaeilge and so on. He wasn't particularly political. I mean, when Casement was buried, for example, was buried in Dublin, De Valera was there as an 80-something-year-old president, the last survivor of the 1916 Rising. So I think, if Casement had survived, I think he could have been quite prominent within the new state as a leading Protestant and so on. I think your argument about him being a romantic idealist is true. I mean, the classic example of that is when he goes to Germany at the beginning of the war and tries to raise a legion of, he promises the Germans that if he goes to British prisoner of war camps in Germany, he can recruit Irish prisoners who've been in the British Army and convince them. He designs a new uniform and everything, and that he can get this legion to fight for the Germans and lead an invasion of Ireland. So this legion would be, would go with him or whoever. Now, the end result of this is I think he recruits 52 people, because most of the Irish prisoners are, not interested essentially in fighting for Germany. So that is like the most romantic, I think, plan he has. The idea of going in the submarine with the arms and so on was not that far-fetched. I think the problem was that various aspects of the plan fell through, including the people who were sent with the trucks to collect the arms drove one of the trucks off the harbour wall and were all drowned. And the other problem was that the ship bringing the arms was intercepted by the British beforehand. So there were several, technical difficulties in the plan. But if the plan had worked, one of the things about 1916 was that the rising happened virtually only in Dublin, because the orders were countermanded by Owen O'Neill, which meant that a lot of the volunteers who rose in other parts of Ireland were told to, disarm and go home. And so there was only sporadic uprisings elsewhere outside of Dublin, although, undoubtedly the rising, even if there had been wholesale risings elsewhere, the rising militarily could not have succeeded in the conditions which existed in 1916 with the power of the British Army and so on. But I think, yes, he had a very romantic view and so on, but you could argue the same of all of the 1916 leaders. I mean, the whole thing was the blood sacrifice by Pearse and so on, that essentially they knew they weren't going to win. And the discussion about Pearse is particularly interesting. And I think the worrying thing about Pearse is there's evidence of possible paedophilia, which is, has not been touched on too much by Irish historians for obvious reasons. But I think Pearse is a much more problematic figure in some ways than Casement is.
I'd say in every way, frankly, but that's another debate we can run.
I think just to go back to Vanessa's point about does it matter, I think it did matter for a long time. It mattered in the sense in which, Casement probably wouldn't have been executed without the Black Diaries. I think the clemency, the weight of pressure from these establishment figures and so on probably would have succeeded. The British government would have been forced, I think, to grant him clemency without the Black Diaries. And so in that sense, they do play a central role. And I think they also impacted on his image after that. So, Irish republicanism claimed that they were forgeries because Catholic Ireland, of course, could in no way accept that one of its heroes was gay. And so, that plays into it's only in recent years that the Republican nationalist movement have accepted Casement's sexuality. And even then, as I said, Angus Mitchell, one of his biographers, doesn't even accept it now. So I think, it did matter. It certainly, maybe it doesn't matter, obviously, to the same extent now, but for many decades it did matter. And the fact that, I gave that story about in West Belfast, if you had suggested to most Republicans, even a decade ago, that Casement was gay, that would have been rejected totally as a British fabrication.
What about the corollary point that you, in the reading you did from Josiah's book, that he put in the mind of the clerk, that how could you be so stupid as to have that diary and not destroy it and have it discovered? Was there a self-destructiveness there, even a desire to be discovered?
That plays into Angus Mitchell's argument that the diaries couldn't be real because Casement wouldn't have been as stupid, knowing that he was an enemy of the British state and so on. He wouldn't have been as stupid as to leave his diaries in his house for the police to find them there. So therefore, Angus Mitchell argues that the diaries couldn't have been Casement's. They must have been forgeries because Casement wouldn't be that stupid. You can look at it either way, really.
And if, again, here's me not knowing enough about Irish history, but who would bother forging his diaries? Would it have been the British government, or who would it have been?
Yeah, well, the traditional argument by Irish republicanism since the Casement trial and supported by Angus Mitchell is that, yes, the British government went to considerable effort to forge the diaries, because they needed to demolish Casement's reputation because he was too important a figure. I mean, if you look at it from the terms of the British establishment in 1916, people like Patrick Pearse and so on were unknown in Britain. I mean, they were non-entities. Roger Casement was very different. He was Sir Roger Casement. He was internationally known. He produced, you know, 2 major reports. He was a major celebrity, if you like. None of the other leaders of 1916 were anything near that in terms of Britain. So it was absolutely vital for them. I mean, how could they explain that a major figure in the British establishment, you know, who associated with its leading writers and intellectuals and so on, could have gone from being that center of that universe to suddenly supporting Irish independence, to suddenly going to Germany and supporting the enemies. And you look at it in the context of 1916. I mean, one of the judges who tried Casement, he'd lost his son on the Western Front. So you can imagine the, you know, the rage that the British establishment must have had towards someone like Cambridge, one of the Casement, one of their own, who turned against them. So in order to explain this, and in order to destroy his credibility completely, you know, they might have to go to these lengths. Now, Jeff Dudgeon argues, you know, the point you just made: would the British establishment have gone to that, you know, to that extent, to in tremendous detail in these diaries, to go to that, you know, to those lengths to destroy his reputation? It's a moot point. Would they have? We don't know. I mean, I tend to agree with Jeff Dudgeon that I think the diaries, the details, you know, are tremendous. And I think, therefore, I think they are real. They're not forgeries. But the opposite argument is that the British went to great lengths to do that.
Martin, did you have a, right, there you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the diaries and the whole authenticity question, I guess it's kind of, it's faintly credible as a theory to suggest that some private diaries detailing sexual exploits of a, you know, queer person may have been invented in order to defeat the campaign for clemency. But it's, that theory doesn't, you can't sustain it in the face of the actual diaries themselves. Because, say, the Black Diary for 1910, it's not just a record of his sexual and romantic encounters, which include, you know, sexual yearnings and desires, as much as they record, you know, sexual acts. They, you know, they include all sorts of things. They entirely precisely map exactly where he was in the world throughout 1910. And he was in many parts of the world, obviously, in Belfast, in London, traveling on the steamer, you know, to Spain, I think, isn't it? Joseph will know, and then on to the Amazon. You know, precisely, the private diary precisely follows his journey up these tributaries of the Amazon into Iquitos, the headquarters of the Peruvian Amazon Company. So, you know, a forger would have had to, you know all of that, know all the geography, intimately know the sort of Edwardian sexual economy. The fact that he's not only having sex with people, he's giving them money, he's giving them gifts, which is, you know, that as I understand it from reading other histories of the early 20th century, that's entirely, you know, that's basically the way gay men were hooked up. And also, yeah, like they have to, he's an amazing botanist, isn't he? So like he's clocking these incredibly unusual flowers in the private diary. So again, it's like, it's improbable that within an incredibly short time span that the various elements of the British establishment had between his arrest and his trial and the desired outcome of his execution. I mean, it would have required teams and teams of people to have manufactured such a thing. So I think, it's sort of entirely improbable. And the bizarre things, I mean, I've been at an event in Goldsmiths more than 20 years ago, at which Angus Mitchell was arguing indeed that the diaries were a homophobic forgery, which was a kind of interesting development, I thought, because he seemed to be sort of shocked and horrified in a way that I think, whereas like someone like Jeff Dudgeon, can read them and kind of go, this sounds kind of familiar, to the lives that gay men live today, as it were, with making, certain, we don't tend to, give each other gifts of money, except in very particular circumstances, maybe. But anyway, that's it. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, Martin, I think you make several interesting points there. I agree with you that the amount of detail in the diaries that, the amount of effort it would take and the amount of time it would take in that time period, that it doesn't appear to suggest that, they could have done that. It would have been, a superhuman effort, really. I think Angus Mitchell's argument, and this has come from some LGBT sources as well, that the diaries are homophobic in their content, the descriptions of the sex, the descriptions of the transactions, and so on. Somebody, I don't know, it was Angus Mitchell or somebody else said that the diaries could not have been written by a gay man, that they come across as, they're extremely transactional and very, quite abusive in some ways, as I've mentioned earlier. But, on the other hand, we're talking here about a closeted Edwardian gay man, what sort of, the furtiveness involved in all of that would be very difficult, I think, for a contemporary gay man to sort of relate to. I mean, perhaps people of an older generation, but I think we have to see it within that light. Yeah. So I think there's someone else with a hand up.
Peter.
Thanks very much. Great talk. Thank you very much. Just two little remarks. One, I'm struck by a similar trajectory of Erskine Childers, who, fighting in the Boer War, saw the limits of empire and ended up, as we know, extreme Republican. And I love the Riddle of the Sands, and wonder, because I would have said that Childers was undoubtedly heterosexual. And then you look at the relationship between the two boys in the Riddle of the Sands. Anyway, I'll leave that there. But the other thing, I don't know how many of you have seen the statue of Roger Casement in Dun Laoghaire. It's quite beautiful. And it's the new Dun Laoghaire Baths. And the statue's been up for about 2 years, I think, but only unveiled recently.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the statue, Peter. That's something I should have mentioned. I haven't seen the statue yet. I'm going to Dublin very soon and I'm hoping to go and see the statue, but it does look quite impressive from the pictures I've seen. And it's outside the newly restored Dunleary sea bats, which apparently are quite impressive. And I'm really glad that Casement has got a statue there and some recognition. I think your point about Childers is very interesting because Dudgeon says in his book that, what would have been the fate of Casement? Andrew mentioned him earlier as a sort of idealistic aristo. And the English people who got involved in 1916, like Erskine Childers, I mean, they met a terrible fate. Childers was executed in the Civil War and so on. And Dudgeon asked the question, what would have happened to Casement? Would Casement have sided with the Free State? Would he have ended up like Childers, being an ultra-Republican and then probably being bumped off in the Civil War or whatever? Or would he have accepted the Free State and would he have then gone on to become a major figure as, like first president or whatever? I think the thing is we don't know. I think it's very interesting that he, I haven't mentioned this, but he tried to organize Protestants in the North to support independence. He tried to get, he'd been to school in Ballymena, and so when we think of Ballymena, we think of Ian Paisley and things, people like that. But he'd been to school in Ballymena, and he came from that area, and he tried to organize progressive Protestants in the North to support independence. And, I think, I mentioned about his burial. Hopefully, at some point in the future, he can be buried in Antrim. But I think his perspective as a Northern Protestant trying to support Irish independence is particularly interesting. I mean, that's why Dudgeon, of course, calls him a traitor to his country and his class.
Mark, you have a comment?
Yeah, hi there. Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. I'm currently doing a THIT project related to Casement, and I've just spent the end of last year over where he was over in Latin America. And actually, geographically now, it's part of Colombia. I mean, not all of it because he was in lots of places, but where the Casa Arana is now is geographically in Colombia. And I was over there kind of as part of research, speaking to kind of like a lot of the indigenous nations who I suppose in a way benefited from Casement and the report that he wrote, and sort of finding out, how else he's remembered over there. I guess something that struck me was just how, I suppose in general, the idea of hearing him being queer didn't really come up, but which was interesting, but or gay. But I think more generally, my question is, why do we think, or why does anybody think there's such a moment of him being a kind of a controversial figure again? It seems to be like in the last few years, even just with the Vargas Llosa novel being written and other events and other discussions, etc. There's such a kind of like his, like who he was and his identity is so up for debate, and just something that's being spoken a lot about at the moment. And I guess my question is why that's happening, do we think? And ultimately, like, who gets to decide how he's remembered? I think that's kind of quite interesting as well, because I think when you were kind of giving your talk, you were very balanced in the way that you spoke, but obviously people have very strong opinions. So I find it fascinating, like why he's being spoken about so much at the moment, and who ultimately I don't know if the question is right or not, but who has the right to decide how he should be remembered at the end of the day? And that's just a thought and a question, I suppose.
Well, I think part of the reason why he's become prominent was to do with the centenary of the 1916 Rising. And again, you know, there were new studies into that. And we're in this decade of centenaries, as they say, between 1913 and 1923. I think the other reason why he's become prominent is because probably of all the 1916 leaders, and certainly of the leaders of Irish republicanism at the time, he was probably the one with the highest international profile. I mean, you just explained part of the reason why. I mean, if you look at, I mean, James Connolly, obviously, as a socialist, you know, has achieved, I mean, Mick Lynch was recent, I couldn't believe it, but a trade union leader on British television was quoting from James Connolly. James Connolly achieved international fame as a, you know, as a socialist thinker and so on. But I think for most of the other leaders outside of Ireland, they're relatively unknown. I think Casement had an international dimension, which is different, and his criticism of imperialism, colonialism, probably came close to, you know, what Connolly probably would have thought. I think the other reason why he's interesting is, you know, the fact that he came from the North and from a Protestant background and so on. And I mean, we've mentioned Childers, and I mean, there were one or two others who came from an English background, but he was probably the only one who came from a Northern Protestant background, which is why I think he's seen as particularly troublesome for the Unionists, for the Unionist historiography, in the same way as they see 1798 as particularly threatening, because there is that tradition of, you know, Catholic Protestants in the centre being opposed to British rule and so on. But I think it's interesting that he's still remembered in Colombia, and I mean, again, you know, Loza has written about him, so there's still a memory there in Latin America.
I think, Joseph, just when you're saying there, I think it's not to be forgotten what Northern Ireland has gone through with LGBT rights in the past few years. And I think that is very much something as well that, you know, any one of ours, you know, I think Irish people in general have that. I mean, today is prime example. Any one of ours who like is up for an Oscar, should we have a quarter of them, you know? So we always take pride in someone who's doing really well. But if it's a member of the community, that, how should we say it? That we'll use the word troublesome again. People don't know how to deal with that. And I think that's part of the psyche of Ireland as well, because it's such a community-based country, if you know what I mean. There's all these little communities everywhere. If there's someone within one of those communities and you're not quite sure, it's kind of puts people out a little bit.
But I think on top of that, Nessie, too, isn't there a serious attempt to like reclaim Casement as a queer Irish hero? I mean, you know, and that's only come about in the last 30 years as we have tried to reclaim all of our heroes. You know, obviously Oscar Wilde and Vanguard, and he's one more, and I think he sort of, and he was, you know, a beautiful man. Let's not forget. Certainly, all the photographic evidence suggests that. So he is a bit of a poster boy as a historical gay Irish figure. So I think a lot of the attention has come because of that, not perhaps as a direct campaign, but because of the interest that intrinsically has generated. I don't know what Joseph, you or anybody else thinks. But to me, I think that seems.
I think the point you make is interesting, Andrew, and I think there are a lot of parallels between Oscar Wilde and Roger Casement. I mean, if anybody has seen the film which came out a couple of years ago, The Happy Prince, detailing Oscar Wilde's last years and his fall from grace and the way in which he became a complete and utter outcast, you know, having been at the glittering apex of British society, being, you know, the ultimate playwright, accepted in all quarters and so on, suddenly to being totally persona non grata.
Very sad.
There are a lot of parallels with Casement. You know, Casement again is the top of British society, honoured, knighted, and all the rest, and suddenly he's totally rejected and so on. There are a lot of parallels. Both of them Anglo-Irish, of course. So that's interesting.
JF has their hand up there in the corner. Hello, JF.
Hello, I have a question, and it's not so much about the authentication of the diaries. It's more around how they were used as an anti-gay treaties in the in the U.S. There's always been talk of they were able to smear Casement, and then the U.S. was able to enter the war because the World War I, because there would have been a lot of sympathy after the executions of the people of 1916. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, I'm just wondering if there's anyone that has any information on that. I have heard people say that the diaries were submitted into the congressional record in the US in a way to taint the Irish Republican struggle, but also to bring the US on board of what was happening in the world. So those are the two.
Thank you. Anyone know anything about that?
I can't comment about the entry of the diaries into the congressional records, but I undoubtedly true that America enters the war a year later. Britain at this point is absolutely keen on getting America involved. I mean, because it's clear that the Allied powers will only win the war if America is involved, and of course that turns out to be the case. There are interesting, again, parallels here with De Valera. One of the reasons why De Valera isn't executed virtually alone among the leaders of 1916 is that he has American citizenship, and the last thing the British want to do is alienate America. So certainly the Black Diaries would have helped British propaganda in, demolishing Casement. I mentioned earlier there was this attempt by the prosecution, obviously backed by the Home Office, to say that he was insane and to argue that he should accept that plea. And again, that would have played totally in the British hands. How could you explain that this paragon of British establishment had suddenly gone to being a rabid Republican? The explanation for that would be insanity. And that would again, support Britain's war aims. So yeah, I think undoubtedly that was an aspect of the black propaganda, if you like, in all of this.
Anyone else have any other comments or anything they want to say or tell us or share while we're here?
I recommend everybody to try and read Jeff Dudgeon's book if you can.
It's really, I keep saying this every time that I talk to you, Joseph. I have a list as long as my arm of Irish history books and stuff that I need to read, and it's shocking that I don't know as much as I should know. From my own point of view, I know that because of where my parents grew up and because of what was going on when I was a kid along the border, there was an awful lot of history you just didn't talk about because people didn't, it was something you wanted to forget about the past, because there was still a lot of, I'm not that old, but I mean, there was still a lot of raw wounds, shall we say. So there was a lot of things that just you didn't talk about, you didn't discuss them, they were just like pushed away. And I think the way Irish history, from when I was in school to what my nieces and nephews are reading and looking at now is different. It is definitely different. And yeah, I think it's worth, well, from my point of view, it's worth having a look at everything again and seeing what you know, adding to my knowledge base, as they say in the business world or whatever. Thanks to everyone for coming along tonight. Thanks to Dr. Joseph Healy as well. Dr. Healy is available for, what are you available for? He's available for talks, he's available for lectures and everything else. Hopefully as well in the next month here, we're going to have a talk about the Brixton squats and what happened in those in the 70s and 80s and 90s and all that area, all that era, I should say. Dates and everything will be confirmed. So if you haven't signed up to our mailing list, please do. We've got some other interesting things coming up to the summer. And now that hopefully it's not going to be as cold, we will hopefully be getting, I say hopefully a lot, because we're still very conscious that not everyone is comfortable meeting indoors and that we have some immunocompromised people within our group. So as soon as the weather gets better, we can start going to more outdoor events and have more outdoor meetups and things like that as well. So we try to be as inclusive as possible. So that's why I'm saying hopefully. So fingers crossed that everybody, you know, we get through the next few months and there's no mad outbreaks of, I don't know, whatever happens to be this time. Again, Dr. Joseph Healy, thank you so much for all your time and effort. I have been at Joseph to do this for quite a while. I'm delighted that we finally got to do it. And to all the new faces and all the old faces that have come along tonight, really, really appreciate you taking your time out. And we hope to see you all at another event really, really soon. So thanks, Mel, for coming along and have a great evening.